do a history of music radio from the early 60s to about the mid 80s. Not for any other reason, but then I'm just a fan. I'm not an authority. I may get some facts wrong. And if I do and you're sure about it, you're a DJ or whatever, feel free to correct me. I'm going to paint this in broad strokes. I have some notes that I'm following, but I'm going to paint it in very broad strokes because, again, I wasn't privy to all the ins and outs. I was just a listener of radio. 1951, well, throughout the 50s, towards the end of the 50s, early 60s, we had something called Top 40 Radio. Top 40 Radio was essentially the top 40 most popular radio tracks. Now, let me explain something. At that time, music was sold in two ways. Okay? I can tell right now this is going to be two videos. Music was sold in two ways. One, there were albums. Okay, now at that time albums were done on vinyl. They still sell vinyl records today. They're about 12 inches in diameter, and they rotated on a turntable, and they played at a speed of 33 1/3 RPMs, revolutions per minute. Okay. But there was, they would have anywhere from, like CDs today, would anywhere from 6 to 10 or 12 tracks or songs on them. But in the record business, certain of those songs, the guys at the music companies knew they would be more popular than other tracks. They could listen to an album, listen to a record and go, that one, that's probably going to sell by itself. So they would excerpt those particular tracks they thought they were going to be popular, and they would put them on smaller discs, smaller vinyl discs, about 8 inches or so. Those were singles. They would play at 45 RPMs. Same record player, but they play at 45 RPMs. They were called singles. Actually, albums were sold there. The albums were two-sided, so they would have maybe 5 songs on one side and 5 songs on the other. Singles had one major song on one side, and then what was called the B side was a song that was a lot less popular. It was just kind of like, really, it was a lot of times like filler. But the main song, the A side on the single disc, was supposed to be the popular one. And in Top 40 Radio, they mainly wanted to sell singles. That's what they were trying to sell. The guys at the record company would pick out from an album 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it was, singles that they thought would sell. And they would play those on the radio, and if they sold well, then they would become part of the top 40 best-selling singles, and that's what Top 40 Radio would play. Now, that was during the 50s at least, and the early 60s. In 1951, there was a guy named Alan Freed who was a DJ from Cleveland, Ohio, and he coined the term rock and roll. That's just an important historical footnote. And Top 40 Radio was aimed primarily at the youth market, kids. Also, let me tell you that at the time, FM radio, while it may have existed, was not used for anything important. People listened to the radio on AM. It was a different kind of... the difference is, if you're scientifically inclined, look up AM radio and FM radio. AM stood for amplitude modulation, FM stood for frequency modulation. It's just the way they're broadcast. The problem with AM radio was that AM radio did not have the capability of broadcasting stereo music. Okay? It also was subject to a lot of static and interference. For example, if you were in a car listening to an AM radio station and you went under a bridge, while you were under the bridge, the station would probably fade out. You probably wouldn't be able to hear it while you were under the bridge, or like in a tunnel or something. You wouldn't be able to hear it. But that's what people used, AM radio. Okay? And that's, you know, up until roughly the 60s. Okay? Another significant milestone in 1959 to 1960, Motown was founded. I just did another video about Motown. Motown was a type of music, but it was primarily black artists, and it consisted of a variety of genres, sometimes mixed together, sometimes pure, but it was primarily black artists. And you would see them show up in the top 40, in top 40 radio. It was top 40 began to showcase black artists and Motown music. So long about 1962, the Beatles came into existence, and we had the British invasion here in the United States. What that meant was a lot of bands from Britain came over, became popular. Their songs were played in Britain. The Americans heard about it. They came over here. Their songs started being played here. The Beatles came over and played Shea Stadium, and they played, you know, you started to get British bands touring and selling records here in the United States. Okay. Now, an important thing. In 1964, remember I told you about FM radio? It existed, but it wasn't used for much. All right. In 1964, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, which is part of the U.S. government, it's part of the U.S. government that controls radio wavelengths and broadcasters and things like that, came out with a no duplication rule. And essentially what that rule said was, if you're going to do FM, let's say you're in Dallas, Texas, and you own a radio station, you own some AM stations in the Dallas market, you can't come out with an FM station in the Dallas market and just copy straight over content from your AM station and put it on FM. You can't do it. Now, I don't know all the reasons for this. I don't know. But radio broadcasters fought this for a few years, and that was in 1964. In 1967, they ultimately lost. They lost that case. So, but they wanted to take advantage of the FM radio band. The FM radio band had some advantages. It wasn't as subject to static as the AM radio band. You could broadcast stereo on the FM radio. It wasn't as subject to, like, if you go into a bridge, you can't hear it anymore, that kind of thing. Okay. Unfortunately, nobody had FM radios at the time. They probably started selling them at the time, but they're probably pretty expensive, just like every other technology. You know, the early adopters pay a high price for adopting the technology early. But there were broadcasters who wanted to open up FM stations. And since they couldn't duplicate content on their AM stations, they had to come up with their own content. Okay? And so our story takes us to something called freeform radio. Okay? And I'll start off with that in the next video.